what percentage of people do you think are walking around emotionally unhealthy?
That's a great question. So I could make an argument that all of us have some level of emotional. I always tell people that that we're all on a journey of self discovery. So every single person has a level of dysfunction, a level of insecurity. The difference between someone who's confident and someone who's insecure or lacks emotional intelligence is that people who are confident don't allow for their insecurities to overwhelm them. So
Mm.
everyone has insecurities. Everyone has some spots if they're pushed up against the wall or certain things, right? So even people who don't allow for that lack of emotional intelligence to come through or that insecurity to come through or the unhealed trauma, they're aware of it. That's the only difference, right? Is that they're aware and they know how to communicate properly rather than coming from a place of insecurity.
Matt, it's so good to meet you, bro.
Nice to meet you as well.
Yeah, man. I love your content. You have
Thank you very much.
such amazing content. And I spent last night kind of going through some of the stuff as well. You talk about so many of the issues that I have, man, struggled with, dealt with, and also done. So not only have I been victim in some
Mhm,
very emotionally toxic relationships, but I've also been abuser
mhm.
because I was in a business cult for
Yep.
2 decades and was very successful. Was financially independent at 30 years old,
Mhm.
all for emotionally unhealthy reasons.
Yep.
Because I was a people pleaser addict, I was emotionally needy, I was emotionally codependent, I was toxic positivity,
Mhm.
insecure, name a dysfunction, and I
Yep.
I had it. And so, because we got so high up in the business, not only were we on the receiving end of those higher, but also we were abusers as well.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
that was very hard for me to come to terms with. Once I started to get emotionally healthy about 4 years ago, I'm like, because I'm like, oh no, woe was me. I'm like, oh crap, like I've been the guy. I've
Right.
been, and so I've called up a lot of people and apologized and like asked for their forgiveness um and it took us, so after 20 plus years in this very emotionally toxic environment, business cult, it took us 3 years to detox
Mhm.
of
It takes
intentional.
time. Yeah, it takes time to go through that healing process, and it takes time to identify it within yourself because people are very quick to point fingers at other people. And that's one of the things that I try to bring through in my content with people I work with is that, yes, we do need to be aware. There's no question that we need to be aware of other people who are toxic and bringing things into our life, but we also have to be very aware of our own behavior because it doesn't make you a narcissist or anything like that if you have some controlling behavior or anything of that nature. But especially if we grew up like that, if we grew up in a toxic system in a chaotic home, the likelihood is that you do have some toxic behavior. If you're in a system like you mentioned, that a system of a toxic workplace. I've been in that system before, or in a church, or that sort of thing. And if you don't have the ability to recognize what healthy is because you grew up in a chaotic home, then it's very difficult for you to recognize it within yourself. But you feel it. You know something's off. You know something's not right. I always call it that hole in the heart feeling where you lack that fulfillment. You feel like something's off, and you don't even realize that feeling is exactly what is causing you to behave in ways to try to get your needs met in an unhealthy way.
Hmm. Man, that's great. And I'll tell you, Matt, like for 2 decades, like to say I was emotionally clueless is an understatement. I had no self-awareness. I
Mhm.
had no social awareness. I had very little self-regulation, self-management skills or abilities. And so I was absolutely clueless that how emotionally unhealthy it was. We were, the method of leadership that we would use was control,
Yep.
manipulation, fear, shame, doubt, disappointment. Matt, I'm just really disappointed in some of those decisions that you're making. And, if you were making better decisions than, than X, right, fill in the blank, whatever.
Mhm.
And I had no idea that all was going on until I started to get emotionally healthier. And then we went back to this other conference, conferences that we speak at. We spoke
Yeah.
at for 15 years, and we went back to that conference after probably 3 or 4 months of kind of starting this emotional growth journey, and we're kind of looking around like, man, that didn't sound, that hits different now. Like, oh, that
Yeah.
right, because we had no concept of, well, I'll speak for myself, and I think I could say some of this for my wife too, but I had no concept of boundaries, Matt, 4 years
Yeah.
ago. No,
Mhm.
no concept. So here I am in the second, third quarter of my life, and not only am I letting people, I never said no. What no was a cuss word to me, right? As a people pleaser addict, so
Mhm.
I would violate, so I would let other people violate my own boundaries, and then in turn I would violate other people's boundaries
Yep.
because I had no frame of reference to any of this stuff. So let me ask you, Matt. So how did you? How, tell me about your journey. How did you become the guy that you are, putting out all this amazing content on all these social media platforms, which I will make sure for all the listeners out there and those that are watching on YouTube, I will make sure to include all of Matt's links and references and videos and all that kind of stuff in the show notes so that you guys all have access to that. And then at the very end, also, Matt, I'll ask you how we follow you and find all your content and stuff. But tell us about your journey.
So I went to school to be a therapist, and what most people will tell you is that everyone who goes to school to become a therapist realizes at some point in time that they're really actually there to try to heal and answer some questions that they have for themselves. And even if and it becomes this journey where you start to have a lot more introspection about yourself. And I had a lot of different situations that came. Grew up in a very domestic violent home. I experienced a lot of toxicity in the church. I'm not anti-church or anything like that. However, I experienced a lot of toxicity in the church. And I started having a lot of rough interpersonal relationships, romantic relationships, and there was just this overall theme that just continued to happen. And so as I kind of went through my own journey and started to talk to different mentors of mine and that sort of thing, I started, my eyes started to come open to a lot of toxic, unhealthy behaviors because when you grow up in the church and when you grow up in certain dynamics, especially as a people pleaser and as a codependent, you think that there's good in everybody. And so there's that. But then you also start to realize your own behavior of people pleasing and codependency, not realizing that you're not actually advocating for yourself, that you're not actually being an adult, you're not actually setting good, healthy boundaries. And so you are putting a target on your back. And so as I started to kind of learn and digest a lot of these things, think these things myself, I eventually went out on my own in terms of coaching and started talking to people about just your kind of your standard dating and relationship coach. And I would get invited to podcasts very similar to this. Well, one time someone specifically wanted me to talk about toxic relationships. And I didn't realize that, I realized I had a lot of knowledge that I had to help heal myself. I didn't realize how much it was actually needed in the world. And so that podcast went viral. They invited me back the next week to talk about it again. It went viral again. I was like, you know what? I need to kind of see where where this actually leads. And so to kind of come full circle, I kind of took a different direction with dating and relationships, and talked more specifically about toxic relationships, not just with romantic relationships, but also just kind of as a whole dynamic, because I started to realize that a lot of people were very much like me, where they may have seen it in a relationship, they may have seen it in a workplace environment like you were talking about, but typically when you have an issue in one area, you start to realize that you have a much more global issue. I always compare it to this. At one point in time, I owned a home in Western New York, and I remember one time I found a bat in my house, and I got rid of it. And I went to a friend of mine who's an exterminator, and I was like, I can't believe that you rip people off, just kind of ripping them a little bit. I can't believe you rip people off. I got rid of the bat myself. You're charging people all this money when people can do it all themselves. And he laughed back at me. He said, if you have one bat, you probably have a much bigger problem than what you are actually aware of. So he came and he did his inspection. We went in my attic, and it was like the bat cave in my attic. And but that story is very reminiscent of people who are in toxic relationships who aren't setting boundaries. When you start to realize that there's one problem, you start to realize that there's a much bigger problem all around. And so that's the story of my life, and that's kind of what I work with people about, of trying to find that balance. And there's no such thing as a perfect person, perfect relationship, but where do we find that balance? Where do we learn how to truly advocate for our needs? Because the reality of it is that a lot of people who are there are some people who are narcissistic who it won't change or anything like that, but there are some people like yourself and like myself who can begin to realize, that can begin to see certain dynamics in ourselves, and realize that when we are able to advocate for our needs, we don't need to be manipulative, we don't need to be controlling, we don't need to be people pleasers or anything like that. And ultimately develops healthier relationships, more fulfilling relationships, and you become a much better person for yourself as well.
Man, huge, Matt. Absolutely love that. Thank you for sharing and kind of sharing your trajectory. So man, I got so many questions. So at what point in your journey, and maybe it started in your childhood, when did you start to become aware of like, okay, that didn't feel good, or like, have you always been self-aware, or how did you develop your self-awareness? When did that start?
I would say that I was self-aware from a very young age. I knew that there was an issue. But now, when we say self-awareness, I knew that there was an issue. I knew that something was off. That's the only way I can describe it.
About
I
what
just did.
age?
I would probably say, middle schoolish,
Wow.
maybe a little bit before, maybe a little bit after, but I knew that something was off.
Okay.
And like I said, I grew up in a domestic violent home, and so there were some spots, I would say, maybe in elementary school, but you're still kind of developing. But I remember just kind of knowing that something's off and not really having certain answers, right? And so you're looking to friends, you're looking to, that's kind of where the problem starts, as a
Mm,
codependent, that you are looking for external validation for something that you need to validate yourself. But the problem is that when you're a child, you don't have any other experiences to go off of, to compare to, so you're growing up in this system that's teaching you to not advocate for yourself, to not speak up for yourself, so you're being conditioned to do these things, and to keep the family secrets and those sorts of things. And so I knew something was off. But like I said, at least when you have a job or when you date and things like that, you can compare one relationship to another. When you have a child, you only have one childhood, so to speak. So you're you're ingrained and enmeshed in the system. So you start looking outside. But the problem is that because you have like this target on your back, like I was talking about earlier, you start to think that the world is all toxic and all mistreating, and the only way for you to overcome that is through codependency and through people pleasing, to try to keep yourself safe. Which, after you begin to heal and after you become self-aware, you and actually start along the self-love journey, you start to realize that that's just not true.
right, right. No, that's great. Okay, so what do you think about this, Matt? So I do coaching as well. I do leadership coaching, executive coaching, and and I've been coaching people for 2 decades, 20 almost 25 years now. And it seems like and this is total anecdotal from my little perspective, so I want to bounce it off you to see if how it hits you. It seems like, and even if me and my wife, our emotional dysfunctions almost fit like a perfect glove. Is that more than just my marriage, or is there other dynamics where it seems like our people say, oh, opposites attract, and oh, we have opposite love languages, all this kind of stuff. I've seen completing emotional dysfunctions.
Yeah.
Is that true, or am
Oh
I
no,
off?
there's 100% truth to that. So I mean, there's actually terminologies for it. So let's say that someone is married to a narcissist. Let's say a codependent is married to a narcissist. That's called the codependent narcissistic dance. And then also competing, we have the anxious attachment style, and we have the avoidant attachment style. Those two are very highly attracted to each other as well. That's called the anxious avoidant trap. And the reason why these type of dysfunctions are so prevalent, and the reason why we're so attracted to people like that, it's not so much about the opposites attract or attack or anything like that, but it's more so about the way that we were raised. We're attracted to, and typically in toxic relationships, this high level of chemistry that we have when we meet someone, right? It's because we're used to it, we're familiar with it, right? This is how we were treated when we were with our parents. So let's say you have an anxious attachment style, and typically the reason why you have one is because you had an avoidant parent who was very neglectful of your needs, and so you're very clingy, always trying to reach out for the love and their attention. Well, guess what? You meet someone who has that avoidant attachment style the way that your parent did, right? That feels comfortable, that feels normal to you, right? And
Mm.
but the problem is that once that honeymoon phase starts to fizzle out, now we're getting to the to the bare bones of what the relationship actually is, and it actually takes work for you to actually advocate and communicate your needs and your boundaries. Well, guess what? Just like we talked about earlier, you don't have that ability. So what do? We reach out from our insecurities and our unhealed trauma. And so instead of saying to the person in a very healthy and a very mature way, hey, I would like for us to talk a little bit more throughout the day. It turns into, where the hell have you been? How come you haven't texted me all day? Right. And I don't care who you are. I don't care if you are emotional intelligent. You're immediately going to get defensive. What do you mean? Right? What do you mean? I've been working, right? Yeah, like, and then all of a sudden, all of us have been in that experience where we know that that's going to escalate, and then next thing you know, people are, they're a narcissist, they're this, they're that. And I don't want to minimize people who are actually experiencing narcissistic abuse, but when we're not careful, if we don't recognize behavior in ourselves, if we don't recognize behavior in other people, and if we don't, we'll think that everything is narcissistic, and not realize that a lot of it is unhealed trauma, insecurities, and lack of emotional intelligence.
That that is awesome. Thank you for sharing some of those unhealthy relationship styles. I've just seen it so, like, again, in our marriage too, and in a lot of other relationships too. And then you can also find it, like you said, in the workplace, right? So
Yeah,
it's not just isolated to personal relationships, but in professional relationships, you can find that as well. What? Okay, let me. This is an interesting question. I want to see how you respond to this. What percentage of people do you think are walking around emotionally unhealthy?
that's a great question. So there's, I could make an argument that all of us have some level of emotional. I always tell people that that we're all on a journey of self discovery. So every single person has a level of dysfunction, a level of insecurity. The difference between someone who's confident and someone who's insecure or lacks emotional intelligence is that people who are confident don't allow for their insecurities to overwhelm them. So
Mm.
everyone has insecurities. Everyone has some spots if they're pushed up against the wall, or certain things, right? So even people who don't allow for that emotion, that lack of emotional intelligence to come through, or that insecurity to come through, or the unhealed trauma, they're aware of it. That's the only difference, right? Is that they're aware and they know how to communicate properly, rather than coming from a place of insecurity. So I would make it so everyone has something, right? Whether it came from childhood, a previous relationship. It's just that some of us are more aware of it than others. It's very similar to, if you I don't know if you played any sports or anything like that, but I have a couple of old football injuries, right? And so now that I'm 40, I'm very aware of them. So guess what? There's certain things I just don't do, right? There's certain
Mm.
areas that I don't go to. There's certain, if I'm If I'm playing basketball with my son, I know where my limits are. I know that I'm limited to 3 to 5 games. After that, I'm done, or I need to be aware that I'm risking injury if I go past that. It's the same thing with our emotional intelligence, right? There's certain insecurities that I have, right? There's certain people that if I were to meet, and there's certain dynamics, certain places, or certain personalities that maybe I may not mesh with. Doesn't make them a bad person or anything like that, but because of my own past and because of my own issues, maybe it's just not a good fit, right? And so we have to be very aware of that. And so when we are aware and we bring our insecurities and unhealed trauma up to the surface, and we give them oxygen, is what I call it, we're able to not allow for things to overwhelm them.
That's great. I love how you talked about that, because yeah, me as a I'm like a cool mod guy, right? So I'm old
Yeah.
school back in the days. I am very, like, I do Brazilian jiu-jitsu, so I am very aware, and I've got some animals in my gym. I'm like, and I'm biggest, oldest, fattest,
Yeah.
guy out there pretty much. And I tell these young, jacked, high speed athletes, I'm like, hey, I do old man jujitsu, bro. So this is gonna be one speed and it's slow. Right?
Mhm.
I'm
Yeah.
like I'm like Flash in Zootopia, right? I'm the sloth, and so
Right.
because like you said, I'm aware of my boundaries, but I love that. Like, we're not always aware. In fact, here's so I want to see how this hits you. So I've been on my emotional growth, very intentional daily emotional fitness program for 4 years now.
Yeah. Mhm.
And thank God, my as a result of a lot of that work, my triggers have dropped in frequency and intensity
Mhm.
by at least 95%.
Mhm.
And now it's so funny. So the reason I bring this up, I've been triggered the last 2 or 3 days,
Yeah.
all up in my feels like Big Drake, right? All up in the feels, and I cannot. It's taken me 3 days to unpack this, and I'm not as far along as I'd like to think I am. I'd like to be able to say, oh man, like, man, I'm super emotionally aware, but man, after this most recent trigger, I still have a lot of work to do. Why is, at least for me, and maybe I'm the anomaly. How hard is self-awareness for many people?
It's very difficult because we have to acknowledge, right? We're going into deep rooted insecurities. So we have to go into our deep rooted insecurities, right? And so the problem is that these are things that have been problematic for us for a long period of time. Areas that someone may have had some sort of conflict, areas that someone has, or let me rephrase, not areas of possible conflict, but someone who has been very critical, right, of you for a long period of time, right? And so a lot of times, because these are insecurities, that means that we're going to have to actually bring them up, and we actually, when I say that our insecurities and our traumas need oxygen, I always compare it to a tree. A lot of times people think that that when a tree grows roots, that it's supposed to go deep down into the earth, and they don't. They actually stay up close to the surface because roots need oxygen, right? And roots, they stay up close to the surface and reach out sideways to try to grasp onto the roots of other trees, and they link up for more support, and they share nutrients with one another. That's exactly what we need to do with our insecurities and our traumas and that sort of thing. We actually need to bring them up to the surface because they need oxygen. So we're aware of them, and we actually make them aware to other people as well, so we can have support and people can change and exchange resources, right? And the problem is that a lot of times we do want to bury them, right? Because we want to act like no one, that they don't exist, because we don't want other people to be aware of them. We are embarrassed by it. We may be embarrassed by the way that it shows up in other relationships. We don't want to be the problem, right? We don't want to acknowledge that we have any problems. If we have a breakup or anything like that, we try to assume, we try to point fingers, right? Because we don't want because the reality is that it's hard work. And if we do acknowledge it, that means that we have to acknowledge that we're a problem, that we've caused a problem. We have to take accountability for things that we may have done in the past. And so it becomes very healing when you actually do it, but it becomes very problematic if you don't, right? And when we would a lot of times people run into this whenever they really want their significant other to change, right? We always, or I say significant other, but anyone else, right? We're trying to push or we're trying to prod other people to change. And I tell people all the time, when you really, really want that other person to go to therapy or to change and you're desperate for them to change, there's typically a lot of change that needs to happen with you. And
Mm,
you are quite often avoiding change yourself when you really want that other person to go. Because what happens is that you're so focused on that other person that you're not even aware of your own behavior. Not only that, but I always tell people that relationships are like a baby mobile, that thing that hangs over a baby's crib. When you start pulling and you start tugging on a toy, right, it starts to affect and starts to impact all the other toys. Well, you, even if you did get that other person to go and they do make all the changes, well, guess what? Because you haven't made any changes, the whole dynamic of your relationship has changed, right? So even if that person does start to communicate more effectively and they start setting boundaries, well, guess what? You're used to that person not setting boundaries. You probably, even if that person is cheating, let's say they stopped cheating and they made all the changes and everything they needed to do, you're automatically going to have trust issues because of that person's behavior. And if we don't start to become more aware of ourself and our own deficiencies because of the dynamics of the relationship, we now then become the problem because of our lack of awareness in ourselves.
that is money. That's awesome. That's a great nuance that I've never considered before. That if I'm so focused on, hey Matt, you really got to change some stuff, bro. You really got to fix some stuff. I'm not doing this. There's like you said, really good chance I'm not doing any reflection on myself on what. And then also like, okay, why does Matt wearing a hat bother me so much? What's going on? Why do I want him to put a blue hat on instead of a black hat? Like, what's the deal there? We just like, no, you just need to change hats, or you need to change your hoodie, or you know what I mean. That's great. In your years of working with people, working on yourself, coaching, what is one of your most effective, powerful tools to help somebody change and grow and get healthier emotionally?
One of the fastest things, because a lot of people I work with struggle with people pleasing and codependency, and we talk a lot about self love. And quite often, I'll ask them, because and a lot of people who struggle with people pleasing, codependency, they're great at giving other people advice, right? They'll tell other people all the time, you should leave that person, you should do this, you should do that, right? Because they easily, very easily, are able to give love, but but because of their lack of self worth and their lack of value in themselves, they won't do it themselves. And so initially, what I very it's very common for me to ask people like, well, what would you tell your daughter? What would you tell your son in this situation if they explain this relationship to you? If they explain this situation to you, right? And very quickly, without hesitation, they're, oh, I would do this, and I would tell them that, and I would tell them that. And I tell people that you deserve the same level of love that you give to other people. That if you would tell your son, if it's not good enough for them, if it's not good enough for your son, if it's not good enough for your daughter, if it's not good enough for these people, it's not good enough for you.
Mm,
And so that's kind of the starting point that a lot of people have to go through when they start to realize that you're giving over a lot of great love and great attention to other people. But when we start to say that we deserve that love ourselves, right, then it becomes very, very uncomfortable. But a lot of times that's the starting point that people start to realize that, yeah, I am deserving of that as well.
man, that's excellent. An excellent tool and way to help somebody kind of look at the issues that they're working on from a different perspective. You change the way you look at things, the things you look at begin to change. And I love that. That's excellent. That's a great way to do that. Okay, so as you are getting healthier emotionally and you become more aware of other people's lack of emotional health or emotional intelligence, how do you work with others and in some cases live with others
Mhm.
that are not that they have maybe lower emotional health, emotional intelligence, and you're growing, you're making changes. What do you encourage people to do in that scenario?
it always comes back to boundaries. You have to know what you are able to tolerate, how much you're able to tolerate. I have people in my life that are friends and family that may lack emotional intelligence. That do I still communicate with them? Do I still talk to them? In some cases, yes. It kind of depends. It depends on. I always tell people that when you're dealing with people, when you have moved over from codependency and people pleasing, I always compare that to a thermometer, right? So before, when people are happy and when they're hot, you're up. When they're down, you're down, right? Up and down. And so you never took responsibility for your emotions, and that's where we lack emotional intelligence. So then we become emotional intelligent, and so now, right, we now are the thermostat, not the thermometer. And so when other people are too hot, right, we can adjust the temperature. We can spend less time with them. We can not take the phone call. We can create a little bit more distance. In some sort of circumstances, maybe we cut that person off completely. Just depends on the circumstances, right? Depends on how hot they are or how cold they are, right? And if we feel like that relationship is a little bit too cold, guess what? We can adjust the temperature up a little bit, right? We can spend a little bit more time with them, but we have to know, guess what? We have to be very self-aware of ourselves to know where our own personal limits are, right? People are gonna disagree with you. Some people, just like your room versus my room, right? You might feel like your temperature is perfectly fine at 75 degrees. I might think it's great at 60, at 60, right? And so people are going to disagree with you on how much time you're spending with certain people or certain groups, but it's your temperature, right? Where do you want that gauge to be at?
Love it. How do you begin advocating for yourself?
Well, first and foremost, we have to be very authentic about the things that we want out of life. And we have to be very aware of like where the direction that we're headed in life. And one of the things I challenge people who struggle with authenticity and things they want, because a lot of times codependents even struggle with that. Like, well, I don't even know who I am. I don't know what I want. Right. But
100%.
some of the things that I challenge them, and it's a very scary question to ask. But I ask them, what do you want people to think about you when you're gone? What do you want them to say about you? Right? What type of life, what type of legacy do you want to leave? And where do you want to be in 5 years? And start asking yourself, some very, very difficult questions. And is the life that I'm living today in the direction that I would like for it to go to tomorrow, right? And so what happens is that when we have a very clear direction and a very where we want to be, and it makes it a lot easier for you to advocate for yourself. So if you eventually want to live in Costa Rica, and someone you meet says, "I would love to live in Canada one day," right? Well, this is, if you're dating, right? Guess what? This probably isn't going to work, right? At least long term. And so the way that you would advocate for yourself is that, I really, I think that it's great that you want to live in Canada, but where I'm headed to, right, is Costa Rica eventually, and so um, the uh, we have to be very, very authentic with who we are and knowing where our limits are, and that's where advocating for ourselves starts to begin.
Well, and that's great. And I like you said too, I wasn't able as a 4 decade people pleaser addict. I was I had no idea if you had said, "Hey Noble, what are your goals or what do you want out of life?" Or I'd ask you first, "Well, hey Matt, tell me what yours are." Ooh, and then I would parrot some sort of version of what you said because I wanted to get validated and affirmed by you.
Yeah,
So I legit 4 years ago had no idea what I wanted out of life. If you would have heard me out, all my goals and dreams were all collections from all the people I'd spent time with
absolutely.
in that toxic, emotional, unhealthy environment. And so I didn't start to learn how to even be authentic. Like
Right,
what does that even mean to a
right,
people pleaser addict? Like, so you're right. I love that. You got to be you got to develop that self-awareness and kind of realize, okay, wait a second, are those when I'm telling Matt my goals and what I want my legacy to be when I'm gone, where's my answers coming
Mhm.
from, right? Am I saying that because I think that's what he wants to hear? Am I saying that because that's what my dad wanted, my best friend wanted, my business mentor wanted, right? Is it attached to somebody else,
Right.
or is that right? So, okay, here's another one I want to hit on. Um, so I grew up in church also. I,
Right.
I had the Baskin Robbins 31 flavors church
Right.
experience,
Mhm.
and and I love Jesus, so that's kind of my faith background, and obviously respect to anyone listening with whatever your faith background is. But for me, I love Jesus. We have had quite a journey though, right? So I started
Mhm.
out in a hardcore Catholic church. Then we went to a evangelical Mennonite church, which is an offshoot of the Amish, which is it's a whole nother ball game, right? Then we went to then we hit Pentecostal for a hot minute. Then we did Assembly of God. Then we did Christian Missionary Alliance. Well, I've had like literally, man. We have. I've got the T-shirt.
Right. Uh-huh.
I had no idea. Again, because I've been emotionally clueless for 98% of my life until the last 4 years, how much emotional unhealthiness there is in churches, bro.
Right.
As long as I can tell you in Jesus' name,
Mhm.
bro, I can get you to do all kinds of stuff.
Mhm.
It's crazy. So why do you think that there's so much emotional unhealthiness in the church?
There's a handful of reasons. Number one, in an unhealthy church, they breed and they enable codependency in the congregation. Um, rather than because it's easier for spiritual leaders to get the needs of the church met, so to speak, when people are not advocating for themselves. And so it's very easy to take advantage of volunteers, take advantage of single mothers, take advantage of people when they're not setting good, healthy boundaries. Right. And so we have to remember that people go to church when they initially go to church, they're not going because things are going really well in their life. They're going there because things are not going very well, right? Because they just went through a divorce. They're looking for answers. They're searching for something, right? So, that when I was in church, people used to say all the time that people come to Christ because there's a crisis. And so we have a lot of people there who have unhealed trauma, who, just like I mentioned before, have a lot of insecurities that they're searching for answers. Well, guess what? They're a prime target to be taken advantage of. And unfortunately, a lot of people who are um, in leadership in churches are have the ability to be covert narcissists or to use their platform to cover their own insecurities, right? And so you put themselves in, they're there specifically for titles, and they know they can escalate through their ranks pretty quickly because their charisma and the way they talk and that sort of thing. And now, because they have a platform and because you now have the word of God that can be used as a tool of manipulation, even though it can be very healing, but even biblically, it can be used for manipulation. I mean, you have the devil who literally tried to gaslight Jesus in the wilderness. And the problem is that part about how the word of God and how um, church and how church people can also be very manipulative. Uh, that part is not taught at church. We're taught that everyone in church is good as long as you get people there, it's healthy. You know, um, People who are going through abusive relationships when they go to pastoral counseling because it looks worse on the church for them to get a divorce, even in an abusive situation. A lot of times they're encouraged to stay because of the testimony, right? And so you have people who there's a lot of reasons why it benefits the church to give people bad advice, whether it be intentional or unintentional, right? To try to save things that really, in a lot of circumstances, really shouldn't be saved.
Well, man, so so that's so money, man. I think another dynamic that I have heard. I interviewed a guy. It's been a while now, who was going to this big giant mega church, and the youth pastor was super charismatic and outgoing and just bringing truckloads in the church,
Mhm.
and very toxic, emotional, unhealthy leader, like literally spiritual, emotional, and physical abuse
Yep.
to many people. But no one said anything because the numbers, right? Hey, he's
Mhm.
bringing in money, he's bringing in revenue,
He's
and
anointed.
he he's anointed. That's exactly right. Well, but look at the gift that God's given it, right? And it's, man, it's just so, it's almost like, it's kind of like the schools. I've never thought about this before, but it's almost like the school system. I was a public school guy, and we homeschool our daughter. She's 14. We homeschool her, but I was a public school. My wife was private school. And it's almost like the same dynamic with church happens in the school system. I feel like it's almost like when you, as soon as you walk into the threshold of those buildings in church and in school, it's almost like you remove all your boundaries,
Mhm.
because you feel like they have my best interest at heart, and there's no way that someone in the church would abuse that trust, or that boundary, or in school, in the school system.
Yep.
And I just think in many cases, not all cases, right? Obviously, there's exceptions and all that kind of stuff, but in many cases, I feel like both are just cesspools of emotionally unhealthy people living out
Well,
their
it's a covert, both of those places, churches, schools, even
colleges.
colleges are a hotbed for covert narcissists. The reason why is because who's going to challenge the pastor? Who's going to speak up against the pastor, especially when you have the entire congregation who is now fed in, right? You are outnumbered, right? You now start getting into groupthink. Who's going to challenge the teacher? Who's going to tell the teacher that no, I think I know my son or daughter better than you, right? When they're the ones that issue the grades, who's going to challenge the principal? Who's going to challenge the professor, right? To tell them that they're being toxic. They're, when they are the ones in control of your grades, they're in control of your future possibly, right? And so, and same thing with therapists, same thing with doctors, right? They're hotbeds for covert narcissism because they're the ones with the education, the degree, with all of it. And so, am I saying that all of them are like that, or am I saying no? I think there's great teachers, there's great pastors, great doctors, great therapists, but it does have the background and um, the environment, the soil, so to speak, right, for everything is ripe for someone to enter there as a covert narcissist and say, well, how could you talk to me that way? I'm the pastor, and to use the fog method, fear, obligation, and guilt, right? If I can cause you to feel one of those three things, right, then I can control the way that you behave, the way that you think. Right. I can't believe that you ever talked to the man of God like that. I can't, and so all of a sudden, what fear? Right? And you're obligated to do this because you're a member of this church, right? And if you don't, there's God's really going to be, God's really, the way that God's going to see this, the way that God views this as sin, right? So now I feel guilty about the things that I do, right? And so you have this dynamic where leadership, when they're unaware of their behavior, or if they're just a covert narcissist, can use all of these things as manipulation.
That's super insightful, and I almost feel like in any organization that is is very delineated with hierarchy and bureaucracy, where there's very defined and clear titles and
Mhm,
ranks and positions. It's just because you see it in corporate America too.
mhm.
Hey, I've, and my background's military. Oh, forget about it.
Oh, yeah.
You give somebody rank and power and a title, man. And then you throw in their little, you stir in a little bit of their emotional dysfunction,
Yeah.
man, and it is on like Donkey Kong. You know what I mean? Okay, so I want to talk to you like all day, Matt. Not able to at this time. How do we find you? How do we follow you? How do we connect with you?
So you follow me on all social media platforms, Matt Phifer Coaching. My website is Matt Phifer Coaching. YouTube, I think, is probably one of my number one resources. You can find a lot. I give a lot of great information. Again, you can follow me on YouTube, Matt Phifer Coaching, and my podcast, The Matt Phifer Experience. And so I'm on all social media platforms. My podcast, you can listen to my podcast live every Wednesday evening on YouTube and Facebook. And I would say that I'm really active both on YouTube and also active on TikTok, Matt Phifer Coaching.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Matt. Absolutely amazing skinny. I can't wait to go back through, take notes, and continue to learn and also consume your content. Really appreciate you investing into the audience and adding value to everyone
No
that's
problem.
listening
Thank
and
you for
watching
having me.
today.
I appreciate being here.